Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we review books of every genre, looking for the best of fun escapist books. Today we're reviewing a nonfiction book, The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. So this is a book dealing with a 1920s, 30s era, mostly, a little bit outside that, but mostly that era, where radium has recently been discovered, several decades before that, but it was discovered that it could make things glow in the dark. And there's a company, a couple companies in this that are like, well, let's use that to paint watch faces so they will glow in the dark. And everybody's like, that's fantastic. Everybody wants to be able to see their watch in the dark. Or instrument panels for vehicles for in the dark, or military equipment like a compass, things like that. And so they hire a bunch of worker class, low class girls to quickly paint the watch faces, typically, but other things too. And their painting usually involves really delicate work. So what the companies told the girls to do was to constantly put the paintbrushes in your mouth to make them a sharp point on the paintbrush. Then you dip it in the paint and you paint, and then you come put it back in your mouth and form the point of the paintbrush and keep going, right? Over and over and over. Thousands of times a day you stick that paintbrush in your mouth. So obviously they're slowly eating radium. And the book is the history of what happened to these girls. As you can imagine, modern scholarship, we know radium is awful to people. It destroys the body. Well, they didn't know that at that time, or at least at the beginning they weren't sure. And it's totally understandable at the beginning of the book because people are basically saying radium is the cure-all, it is the miracle drug, and they put it on everything. You could find products, you could find a jock strap dosed with radium. I'm sure that was totally healthy. Anyway, it was in medicine, it was in all sorts of things. So the girls that are starting to do this painting thing, they just thought this was a great thing. They could literally take some extra paint home and paint their fingernails with it and, cover themselves with it. One person painted her teeth with it, and they go out at night and they would glow in the dark. You can imagine again how attractive that would look, that they were shining. This is why the subtitle is The Dark Story of America's Shining Women. So anyway, that's kind of the backstory. And then this book focuses in on several of the women and basically what happened to them. And not just health-wise and their family and their circumstances, but also legally. Like when it started coming to light that radium was actually dangerous, what happened with them trying to get the company to acknowledge that or to reimburse them for all their medical expenses or anything like that. So it was kind of their story encompassing everything that happened with the radium. Okay, so this is a nonfiction, and it really happened. And the author, so starting with things I really like, the author did a fantastic job with their research. You could really tell this was research to the hilt, that the author delved into court transcripts and to scientific research, what they did, and letters between all the women and their families and their family histories and newspaper clippings, and oh my goodness, it just felt like really good scholarship in this book. The author did a really, really good job on her history and getting it in. And on top of that, she made it readable. This is not filled with technical jargon. This is not a book that feels like you're reading a really dry research paper. This really had a lot of good scholarship, but meshed with good writing. Good writing for making you feel immersed in the story of these women. Good in that because there's hundreds of characters that are mentioned throughout this book, like so many, because there were hundreds of girls involved in this, plus all the lawyers and the doctors and the dentists and the surgeons and the scientists and the newspaper writers and all the company levels of management. There are a ton of characters in this book. And the author does a pretty good job of being pretty clear on who people were, how they related to other people, and what their task is, what their role is in this saga. And you don't feel too lost. If there's a character that comes up repeatedly, the author does a pretty good job of making sure you knew who that was. So the scholarship is great, the writing is good, you feel like this is not quite a novel, but close enough to a novel that you could really follow the story. There is a story arc going on here as history progresses. And so the author does a good job with making this a readable book, despite how big it is and how technical. It does have a lot of that in there. So that's something I really like. I do think this was a good tribute to the women. Like, it really felt like it honored the women that it was referring to, the ones that horrifically died, that pioneered a bunch of research through their devastated bodies of things that affect us today. And so the author was really respectful of the women, the families, the trials that they went through dealing with that. So I think that the author did a good job of that. It didn't feel sensationalized, really, more so than it needed to be. It doesn't feel melodramatic in that respect. So I think the author did a great job on that. It was sympathetic, would be another term I would use. Not just a tribute to what they went through, but it was sympathetic. It felt very human, close to the women. So that was good too, including their families, and it didn't always shy away from some of the negative as well. Like, one woman had an abusive husband that hit her several times, but she didn't divorce him, despite having to go to the hospital and stuff, because she was like, I've been hit before, no big deal. And you kind of look at that and go, oh, that's pretty sad. But the author didn't skip that part of her story just because it's negative, both on, her husband, but also on maybe her judgment, to stick around with that. So things like that, it doesn't feel too whitewashed on how good, how angelic, how saintly the women were. They weren't perfect. And they made some poor choices. Some that they were manipulated into making poor choices, and some that, historically you look back and say, you shouldn't have done that. But maybe you didn't know it at the time. So they weren't perfect people here. But it was very sympathetic towards them. Okay, things that I didn't like. So I'm going to say right now, this, if it had been a fiction novel, would be in the horror category. Oh my goodness. The horrific descriptions of these people's pain, agony, and gross deaths. I mean, radium doesn't just give you one symptom. It's not just like you're exposed to radium, okay, now you're going to get cancer and die. No, the first person I think that died on this that they described, it was awful. Her jaw rotted in her face. They had to remove it. So her mouth was gaping open. And then the radium ate the back of her throat. She literally drowned in her own blood because the radium ate through the tissues in her back of her throat, and she drowned. And you just think about that. And that is agonizingly horrific way to die. I mean, just awful. And then another person, she had basically bone cancer, and the bone swelled and deformed and ended up breaking through her skin and having these open wounds that would not heal, and just on and on and on. Just horrific, all over variety of ways that this radium destroyed the human body. They were, it crushed spines, it shrunk legs, it people over and over again, their teeth were falling out and leaving open wounds in their mouth, and just anyway, over and over again, it described in a lot of detail how these people horrifically died and or lived in pain. One person survived until like 80, but she had an arm amputated and one leg shrunk, and she, it was just like all this litany of things that were wrong with her, but she did survive, and you're just like, oh. So it edges on horror there, just because of I'm an empathetic person. When I read a book, I want to be the character, but I don't want to be the characters in this book because it was so painful. I just kept going, this is awful. I was telling my husband that I can't read this book right before bed because this is going to give me nightmares. It felt so icky. And not just the level of description of the gore that happened, these medical deformities that happened to these women. It was also because it was pervasive, evil injustice. So bad. This was a case of so many people, and it was shocking how many people knew that radium was killing people. It was really, really clear, and flat out kept lying about it. The corporate profits were far more important than the lives of these women to way too many people. And I'm not talking just the corporation itself. There was lawyers that were clearly motivated by money. There were doctors that were clearly motivated by money. Dentists and stuff, that they would just flat out lie on death certificates. Oh yeah, she died of this other thing. Was it from her company? Oh no, absolutely not. Despite the fact that she's glowing in the dark, totally that didn't kill her. No. Things like that. That you were just like, why would they put anything over the lives of these women? But over and over and over and over, these people would stand as a barrier to fixing the problem. They didn't want to stop new women from coming in and painting the dial faces. They didn't want to acknowledge that the women who were dying off in droves was because of the radium. They didn't want to acknowledge one company man, he's standing in front of somebody who's limping, another person who has an amputation, another woman who is literally, her jaw has come out in her mouth, pieces of her jaw is falling out into her mouth. And he looks at them and says, I don't see anything wrong. No, you're perfectly healthy. He flat out says that to their faces. And you're like, wow, because he's a company man. And so this kind of evil that I just cannot even wrap my head around, people being like this, was disturbing. And so it was hard to read this book. It was, if I hadn't needed to finish the book for making a review and stuff like that, I would not. A couple of chapters in, I'd be like, nope, because this was so hard to read. It was an endless stream of greed over compassion, and that's just awful. Okay, one other thing that I didn't love about this, but it was real, is the ending. The author really tries to make a hopeful ending, meaning the author shows how their suffering did lead to good general outcomes. So, for example, some laws were changed. So before the Radium Girls had their issues, there were no laws on the books about compensation for industrial poisoning. But they got that on the books. Because of this, it was kind of indirectly led to some changes in not just laws, but in industry standards on how you are required to protect your employees. So, for example, things that impact us today. If you're in any kind of company that uses chemicals industry, even bleach, there are a bunch of industry standards that have to go through as far as the bottles need to be labeled with what is hazardous and how you should handle it and what chemicals are actually in this jug of who knows what, right? And you can sue a company if they don't follow these standards, if or report them to labor and industries or whatever, that kind of things. So there's huge changes in how industry works. Medical. Interestingly enough, it was amazing in this book. I had no idea how pervasive it was that during this time, people could go to a doctor and the doctor would not tell you what they discovered about you. So like, for example, if they took a blood test or whatever, and you went up and said, so what did the blood test say? The doctor could just say, I'm not going to tell you. Too bad, you don't need to know. Or they could lie to you. It was amazing how many doctors lied to them. And they weren't always maliciously lying. Sometimes they were, because they were wanting to not support the idea that radium was bad. But sometimes they were lying because of compassion. They're like, you are terminal, you're going to die in a couple of months. But they didn't want to tell them that because they felt at that time that hope that you were going to survive would be helpful for making you survive. So they didn't want to tell somebody if they were fatally dying, which today is kind of backwards because doctors are supposed to tell you the truth about your stuff. They're supposed to tell you if you take a test and you ask for the results, they need to give it to you. So things like that have changed. And I'm not sure if it was directly causal because of the Radium Girls, but it probably had some impact. And finally, in the nuclear industry, all these safety standards and stuff that are out there, they did test after test after test after test of the effects of radiation on these dead corpses and the ones that were living but were still affected, and to basically go, okay, what is the effect of radiation? Oh my goodness, it's so horrible. Let's try and prevent anybody else from having the same problems that they did, which is great. I mean, that is a good outcome, generally speaking, but the ending was not a happy one for the women. It was death after death after death after death after death after death, and the same thing kind of happened with the court battles. They lost and the industry won, and they were trampled. There was one court case that they won, but they didn't get hardly anything from it. Like, the court case was the one that they won, the person that should have gotten the money, the corporation appealed and appealed and appealed and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and by the time they got to the end of the appeal process, she had died. And according to the law, once she's dead, the industry doesn't have to pay anything. Not to her family, nothing. So, sad for her. And you look at that and go, and it was pretty clear, they were appealing and appealing, they appealed every way that they possibly could in order to delay, specifically because they were hoping she would die before they had to pay her anything. And again, how evil is this? So the court cases, even when they won, they lost. It was bad. It was so bad. Okay, my overall opinion on this book is it was excellently written. It was really important. This is the kind of book that if you want to know about history, real life, the way it really worked, and it doesn't disturb you too much about all the gore and how awful it was and how there really wasn't ever really any good justice for the women, then this would be a good book to read, but it was not fun. This was not a fun escapist read. This is not one that I would recommend for somebody who wants something happy. Or at least or even comfortable to read. It was hard to read. This would be a great book, though, for a book club. Like, you could do really good questions on industry accountability, the role of government, how medical standards have changed, on how people have rights that they didn't have before, at least in America. So, yes, this was definitely a book that would be good for discussion for people if you could handle it, but it's not a fun read. Okay, Next book, I am going to go do something a lot more lighthearted, at least I hope so. We're going to do a fantasy. City of Brass. So by S.A. Chakraborty, maybe. So this is, I think it is not part of a series, but it looks like it'll be a fun escapist book that'll be much more lighthearted. So we'll do that one next. I hope you join me, and thank you for watching.